The title of my presentation is a strong critique of epistemological relativism, the practical difficulty convincing the non-relativists. This paper critiques strong epistemological relativism as presented by Sawyer in his 1982 article, True 4. Strong in this context does not refer to a version of epistemological relativism that possesses the most inductive strength. Instead, the term strong qualifies the degree to which a theory opposes a non-relativist conception of truth. First, the paper defines epistemological relativism, and in particular, strong epistemological relativism. The paper then investigates the common objection posed against relativism, which is the objection of self-refutation. After analyzing the objection, it is concluded that SCR, as Sawyer presents it, lacks persuasive power. Many theories of relativism fall under the label relativism. Many theories fall under the label relativism. In his article, Relativism, Drummond defines the term as a relational concept whereby some quality A is said to be relative to some external frame of reference B. Any claim of relativism, according to Drummond, thus describes two factors: one, that which is relative, and two, to what it is relative. Drummond explains, however, that the quality A cannot be relative to itself. Rachels and Hack indicate that there are many different theories of relativism, and I've indicated a couple examples here on this slide. But some theories of relativism, according to Hack, are more probable than others. Moonsey and Fisk present one definition of epistemological relativism. In their work, Cognitive Relativism, the Practice of Marketing Science, they define epistemological relativism as the claim that truth itself is relative. Applying Drummond's two-step criteria of relativism, they describe the quality truth as relative, but their definition fails to meet the second criterion. They avoid giving a concrete definition of the frame of reference to which truth is said to be relative. To mitigate for this problem, one can turn to Cleave's use of the concept perspective. To give a complete definition of epistemological relativism, it would be defined as the claim that truth is relative to each perspective. Cleave states that perspective is the frame of a context from which the truth of a proposition can be assessed. Her definition of perspective is useful because it allows one to give a complete definition of epistemological relativism and to directly critique the quality truth alleged to be relative rather than the frame of reference classified. Although Cleave uses an example to indicate that one's individual moral standards could be a perspective, perspective could go beyond the subjective level. Perspective could be the law in one's jurisdiction, a religious book, or one's cultural background. Mandelbaum's discussion of relativism demonstrates that perspective does not solely refer to one's individual subjective perspective. According to Mandelbaum, perspective could be a subjective, objective, or conceptual framework. Whenever a frame is used to evaluate the truth of a proposition, it functions as a perspective. Critiques in this paper, however, do not problematize how the relativist defines frame or perspective, but rather the quality truth alleged to be relative. Sawyer's description of SCR consists of two relevant claims. First, epistemological relativism asserts that truth is relative, but it does not assert that the standards of truth are relative. As Vellacillo explains, epistemic relativism focuses on the criteria of truth, whereas epistemological relativism focuses on the property of being true. The second relevant claim about Sawyer's discussion of epistemological relativism is that it concerns a strong form. According to Sawyer, epistemological relativism, in the strong sense, implies that P is true from one perspective but false from another perspective. Epistemological relativism, in the weak sense, as Sawyer calls it, implies that proposition P is true from one perspective but incomplete and untranslatable from another perspective. Sawyer's construction of SCR assumes that languages are commensurable, that statements from languages can be translated while maintaining the same meaning and the same truth conditions. A weaker formulation of epistemological relativism would favor a theory like Worth's linguistic relativism, the notion that languages are incommensurable. The truth table for P would be complete in one perspective, meaning all truth conditions would be known, but incomplete when expressed from another perspective. Not all truth conditions would be known, not all rows would be filled out with T's and F's. Thus, SCR, as described by Sawyer, claims that a statement's truth and falsity is relative to each perspective, and that statements from different perspectives are translatable. SCR allows one to say that P is true from perspective A, but false from perspective B. Now, I've given the definition of strong epistemological relativism as defined by Sawyer. And now the paper turns to common objection posed against relativism, which is the objection of self-refutation. The objection goes as follows. SCR claims that truth is relative. The claim that truth is relative is either, to each perspective, is either absolutely true or relatively true. If it's relatively true, then the non-relativist position is also true as well for her perspective. If SCR is absolutely true, then it is unclear how relativism is granted the position of being absolutely true, but other theories are not. Thus, the non-relativist will not be persuaded because her theory is also true for her perspective, or she is unsure how relativism is true in the absolute sense, but other theories are not. In his article on the paradox of cognitive relativism, Milan describes the above objection as a self-refuting objection, and he attempts to argue that this objection does not discredit SCR in its entirety. In this context, self-refuting does not mean that the premises embedded within SCR are logically inconsistent with one another, or that they cannot all be true simultaneously. According to Milan, the self-refuting objection alleges that SCR condemns itself. SCR, as characterized by its critics, condemns itself because the relativist cannot convince a non-relativist. In the extended paper, I focused my analysis on both premises 3 and 4, considering the implications of SCR being either absolutely true or relatively true. But in this abbreviated presentation, I will limit my analysis to consider the implications of SCR being relatively true.